This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
We would not have Marvel as we know it without Stan Lee. People say, oh, well, Batman's human, he has no superpowers, but he's got a butler.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
For some of us, Stan Lee is a household name, but there are some people listening, my mother for instance, who will go, who? Well, Adrian MacKinder has written Stan Lee, How Marvel Changed the World, to tell them, really. He joins us now from wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen on Skype. Adrian, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Thanks, Tim. Good to be here.
So, who was Stan Lee?
Who was Stan Lee? Well, Stan Lee was, in a nutshell, one of the most significant creative/marketing forces of 20th century mainstream entertainment, I would say. He was the man who liked to tell the world that he was behind some of the most iconic superheroes and comic books ever created, first in America and now the world. So we're talking Fantastic Four, we're talking Spider-Man, we're talking Incredible Hulk, we're talking Thor, we're talking the X-Men, Avengers, so on and so forth, coming to a cinemaplex near you. He's the man who started it all, or so he would like to tell you.
Well, yeah, he said, I mean, your subtitle here is How Marvel Changed the World, and I was going to suggest that subtitle was a trifle hyperbolic, but you're more or less suggesting that it's not, that he was a force of nature.
Yes, I would say, yeah, it is a little eyebrow raising because it does sound like, messianic to a certain extent. But I think the upshot, without giving away too much of the book itself, is that, the Marvel universe is that we now see populating our cinemas when we're not in lockdown, is the most successful, highest earning movie franchise in the history of cinema, and we would not have Marvel as we know it without Stan Lee. Full stop.
So did he? He didn't start Marvel Comics. He wasn't the man who set it up.
No, that was a man called Martin Goodman, who was actually a relative, a distant sort of in-law type relative of Stan Lee, and he set up back when it was called Timely Comics.
And when was this? We need to be specific in time. Yeah. So
we're talking the 30s. So, Detective Comics DC, that was the comic book company of the time. It was known as they are responsible for what I call the holy trinity of superheroes, the original three that still tower over everyone else. So DC had Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman. Created in 38, 39, and 40, I think, for Wonder Woman. And then Timely was one of the many sort of, they were known for basically publishing pulp titles of any kind of genre. Martin Goodman was a canny businessman. He didn't believe in creating anything unique. He believed in jumping on what was popular and just bashing it out. And he almost went on record saying it doesn't matter how good it is. The point is, it should be what people want to buy because they're already buying it. So Stan Lee, he wasn't even 20, started working with his relative's firm at Timely.
Now, he grew up in during the Depression, so he's gone to work for Timely in the 30s when he's still basically a kid, isn't he? But he was nearly 40 when the magic started. Did it just take him that long to think of all the Marvel heroes?
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting part. I always think it's rather inspirational for people that are kind of toiling away in a certain profession to know that, your big break can come when you're pushing middle age. He'd been there for 20 years. Obviously, the war sort of interrupted his tenure. And he'd grown, so he says, disillusioned with writing comics because he was, as I said, bashing out any old crap, if I may use that word, so genre things. And as he saw it, and the story he gives is that he was very fed up. And then basically the people above him said, we need to create superheroes are back in, Stan. We need to come up with something else, a new kind of superhero. The Justice League's doing really well over at DC. Maybe we can have a new kind of team up.
And this is
superheroes.
about 1961, isn't it, that we're talking?
This is 61, exactly. And he went home, and this is his version of stories, and he said, I just don't want, my heart's not in it. I want out. I don't like writing comic books. I think they're trivial and juvenile. And his wife, Joan, said to him, well, why don't you do something that you want to write? If you were going to leave, if you were going to quit, do what you want to do. And if Martin says, sorry, this isn't what I asked for, you're out, you've lost nothing. So he came up with, so he says, the Fantastic Four. And then it was a hit. And then there was this extraordinary purple patch from 1961 to basically 1965, where all those tentpole Marvel characters were created.
And all the characters that we're seeing on screen now, all the X-Men's and the Daredevils and the Avengers, all of them started then.
Exactly. Even down to the fact that the Avengers #1 and X-Men #1 came out in the same month. Those two titles came out in September, I think. I can't remember which one of the 5 years it was in, towards the back end, like 63 or 64. But that's astonishing in itself.
So what was it that Stan Lee did? What was revolutionary in his approach, when approaching 40 as he was, that was different from what DC had been doing with Batman, the Flash, and Superman?
Sure. What he did was he imbued these characters with what he called feet of clay, so far as they were human first. Take the Fantastic Four to begin with. They were a squabbling family who had their superpowers thrust upon them in an accident whilst in space. This wasn't a case of, I'm Superman, I've just been born this way. Batman is slightly bit similar because it was the trauma of his parents being killed that led him to commit to a life of vigilante crime fighting.
But Batman had got very camp in the 50s. It was...
Exactly. He'd gone far away from Bob Kane and Bill Finger's kind of much more violent inception, I think. And so, yeah, basically he wanted these people to be flawed. He wanted these characters to be flawed, and that's what it was. So they bickered and they fought. There's one story arc early on where they face eviction from their home in the Baxter Building in New York. So this was not superheroes as we knew it. I mean, they're much more relatable. I mean, you can't really relate to Superman because he's an alien with godlike powers. You can't relate to Batman. People say, oh, well, Batman's human. He has no superpowers, but he's got a butler. He doesn't live a relatable life. He's a millionaire, as it was back then. That was enough. And Wonder Woman is an Amazonian sort of deity on Earth. And then Spider-Man is the archetypal one that I think is the paradigm for the Marvel philosophy, insofar as he is a school kid. He would normally be a character reserved for the sidekick, like Robin. He was a school kid who was a nerd. He wasn't popular. The opening page of the first Spider-Man story is him being teased for
and not handsome either, not buff.
No, not at all. And I think a lot of that goes down to the artwork and the creative input of Steve Ditko, who basically imbued the character with his own. Steve Ditko was a notorious recluse. He only gave a handful of interviews in his entire life. He famously walked away from Marvel in the mid-'60s and never returned. He imbued this sense of outsider, this geekiness into Peter Parker. And I think that's what resonated. That's the story. And that wasn't just Stan. That was a collaborative approach with him and his other creations, namely Jack Kirby, who did basically all of them except Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. And then Doctor Strange and Spider-Man was Steve Ditko. Answer your question, what else Stan did that was unique was he created this hugely empathetic sense of community amongst the readers. He spoke at eye level. Some of the comics were very meta. He broke the fourth wall. He often included some of the writers in the comic panels. And he had a thing called Stan's Soapbox where he would talk to the audience,
So he brought the readers in as a community and tried to turn them into like a gang.
Yeah, not more than a gang. It was an army. I mean, he has these wonderful pseudo-military phrases. It became his catchphrases, like he would start with "face front, true believer." Which he used a lot. Repetition. He was brilliant at, wasn't he? In fact, he was brilliant at a very deft touch for all these ways of enhancing, well, his own profile, but the cohesion of Marvel Comics as a phenomenon. Oh, absolutely. The idea of creating an integrated universe was a masterstroke. apart from a cynical marketing financial perspective, it was great because you had to buy other comics titles to find out what was going on in this big story arc. But then, as we've seen, they actually steered away from that in later years because someone pointed out, and this is a valid argument, it's exhausting for a kid who wants to buy a few comics that he feels he has to read up on this whole backstory and all these other titles just to spend his 10 cents. But it's paid off dividends.
Yeah, but in the 60s, I remember there were about a dozen titles. And I mean, since then, they've exploded. I mean, Marvel only had about a dozen titles. I was a big comic reader as a boy, so,
right.
this is
so
my comfort zone, yeah. But there were
Yeah.
a dozen titles, and if you didn't need to read Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos if you didn't want to. The superhero ones could be 6 or 8 a month, which is, I mean, it's a lot of comics to buy for a kid. But it wasn't an unmanageable universe.
No, absolutely not. And that existed in my time as a kid. I was a child of the 90s, and that's when I was really into comics. And as you said, it was manageable. There was a lot of things where all the stuff that really broke the coffers at the Hollywood now with the Avengers Endgame and the Infinity Gauntlet story, that all came out when I was really into comics. And I remember getting all the crossover comics to tell that story. And I got so excited about it, and it was manageable. It did, however, lead partly to the downfall of Marvel in the 90s when the company declared itself bankrupt. But that's a whole other story that I get into in the book.
How far is the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all these movies, and the cohesion of them, how far is that a result of copying Stan's vision of Marvel from the 60s?
I think in one sense it is completely due to that. Because no one was doing it in the same way. No one had created this interconnected, and I would say the key thing is an interconnected, relatable universe. Because another thing that DC didn't do is they didn't put them in a sense of a place. Batman was in Gotham City, Superman was in Metropolis. They were fictional cities. We all know they were both based on New York, but these Marvel characters had addresses. So you knew that Doctor Strange lived in Greenwich Village. You knew that Captain America was from Brooklyn and Spider-Man was from
the X-Men were up in Westchester County.
Westchester, absolutely. Yeah. So he created this by using a tactile sense of geography that he knew because he was born and raised.
Because he was a New Yorker. It was his stamping ground.
Absolutely, very much so. I mean, he was born in, even though it wasn't a particularly affluent family, and it was first-generation immigrant family, he was born in Manhattan. And then they traveled around a lot. Due to his father's varying fortunes, struggling in the Depression. But I think that tangible interconnected universe is entirely down to what Stan did when he was editor, you see, because he became editor very quickly, partly due to the war, and partly due to probably a bit of nepotism. But he suddenly found himself, but he wasn't even 20 when he found himself having to edit the comics, which is quite astonishing.
There are other things that brought him to prominence early. We're going to have to talk about Jack Kirby a little bit. I adored Jack Kirby when I was a kid.
Rightly so.
Kirby was the other half of the force that made Marvel work. He was the artist. He used to draw the pictures, and he was what Marvel Comics looked like. Now, he was older than Stan. He was already established, and he was working for Timely when Stan turned up, more or less as the office boy. He was bringing him coffee, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, he was basically just the little gopher, and he would say that he basically likened him to just an annoyance that used to sit around playing an ocarina in the office, which just wound them up. Because they couldn't be more different as well, because Kirby was a stocky, gruff, cigar chomping, a very sort of taciturn, monosyllabic guy who didn't really suffer fools or guff much, and Stan was full of guff.
And Kirby didn't have the social skills, didn't he? He didn't have the self-promotion skills that Stan Lee did. Now, you tell a story about how it was Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were a team,
yes,
and they'd invented Captain America, back in the 40s.
Yes,
they left Timely, and the question is, did Stan Lee rat them out? Tell us the story and tell me what your opinion is.
It's an interesting story because basically, yes, they were moonlighting for other comics, and to the extent that they had rented a hotel room, and they would disappear at lunch to go away and work on these other titles. And one day, Stan kept, according to Jack, was pestering them to go, "What are you guys doing? Can I tag along?" And they let him tag along. And then, suspiciously close to this happening, they were suddenly confronted by the Timely team saying, "We know what you're doing. You guys are out." It was seen as like a betrayal to Martin Goodman and his little family business. And to this day, well, to the day he died, Jack Kirby was convinced that it was Stan Lee ratted them out.
What do you think?
I think it wouldn't surprise me, but we'll never know. I know that sounds like a cop-out, but I do think that it gets very murky, as I cover a lot in the book, when you start talking about who did what to who created which character. There's a lot of he said, she said. Yeah. Simon is much more diplomatic about it because he says that we don't know, and let's be honest, it was such a small company and everyone knew everyone in the comic book industry at that time. It was highly unlikely. It was like the worst kept secret that they were doing it. So they probably got a little lazy and it was only a matter of time before they were found out.
So Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were fired.
Yes.
Kirby was sure that Stan had been the agents of this. Why then did Jack Kirby go back to work for Marvel and for Stan at Stan's invitation?
Exactly. That's a very curious thing. And I think the truth is clouded by the fact that Jack Kirby himself was a little loose with the truth in later years when talking about the inception and his involvement in creating the Marvel Universe and also his relationship with Stan. I think there may have been a financial drive for Kirby to actually come back because it was steady work and he was treated and revered highly. He was the king, he was the king of comics. So I think that it may have been nothing more complicated than financial expediency. The one thing that I find very interesting is they clearly had a professional rapport, despite what Jack's much more bullish. He said that at his most extravagant, he would say that Stan, he never saw Stan write a single thing. I did everything. I created. He says in one interview, he says, "I created them all. I came in and they were literally tearing out the desks, and I saw Stan in his office crying, and I was basically like he was sort of Sir John Harvey Jones troubleshooting to come in and fix the struggling Timely." But to work that closely together in that kind of creative environment that's that collaborative because of the Marvel method, which we can talk about if you want, but I mean, that's all part of why
we need to talk about the Marvel method because it does challenge this question of how much Stan was writing the books. So quickly, can you do the Marvel method?
The Marvel method is very simple insofar as it's the writer would come up with an idea maybe and bash it around with the artist. The artist would go away and write and create the panels, maybe, and it would even involve actually outlining a story put to the page, and then the writer, in this case Stan, would go back in and fill in the balloons, the dialogue balloons, with the dialogue. So it would be fine-tuning maybe story. What it does is it's a very, very, very back and forth creative approach that completely blurs the line for creative ownership. So you do not have a line drawn in the sand as to knowing where the artist's work ended and the writer's work began. And if anything, you'd think that the Marvel method probably gives the artist more freedom, because they're just sent away with an idea and then they create a comic out of it. And then Stan could have fine-tuned the words into his admittedly talented ability to create, zinging, sass-filled dialogue with memorable lines. So the artist, I think, probably gets a little more credit doesn't get enough credit in general for the Marvel method. I interviewed several people who have worked with the Marvel method in writing the book, and there seemed to be an equal amount who liked it and who didn't like it, which I thought was very interesting.
But Stan was always ready to take as much of the credit as was going, wasn't he? He will agree that Kirby was the co-creator of the Fantastic Four and the Hulk, and that Steve Ditko was the co-creator of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange. But he was very happy to be the face of Marvel and to be credited with their invention.
Very much so. Well, I think the thing about Stan is there is no doubt of his input in what he did. And as a marketeer, he was a genius. That's where his true talent lies, I think, in promotion, either self-promotion or promotion of the brand. But what he tended to do was not correct people when they gave him a little bit too much credit. So there would be articles and interviews when Marvel started to become a thing, where it would say Stan Lee, creator of Marvel Comics, and he wouldn't correct them. You know, he would be very enthusiastic about his praise for Kirby, and he loved the fact he did say, look, it was great that I could give Jack just a line and he would go away and create this wonderful world. And he got more diplomatic and more magnanimous about sharing the credit as he got older. I think because he realized he couldn't get away with it much longer, because there have been several artists who'd complained about basically Marvel stitching them up.
And also, things were going really well for him. I mean, it was a sort of a seamless rise that he had.
Very much so. It was very much so. It was meteoric, as I said, in this purple patch of 5 years in the 60s. I mean, and he, you know, when he became sort of editor-in-chief and what have you, he stopped actually writing directly. The Marvel machine was very much underway in terms of the Marvel method was working. They got in some superb talent. You know, like Roy Thomas, who became his protege, who was the first editor-in-chief after Stan. So the second ever editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics. Jim Steranko, another brilliant artist who did some very interesting artwork, very unique approach. But yeah, I think that, you know, Kirby and Lee always had this they were like the Lennon and McCartney. It's a horrible hackneyed cliche,
Yeah.
but that, of Marvel. But it's true of Marvel Comics. What they did was gold. You know, the creation they did, and they just hit a roll. Whether or not Kirby did it all, and then Stan just tweaked a few lines,
Well,
we will never
Stan
know.
was doing the
Of course, there's no
dialogue,
documentation.
which he did have a
Yes.
talent for. You always knew with Stan's dialogue which character it was. You couldn't mistake the Thing for Spider-Man. They spoke completely differently. So that's good. But how good an actual writer was Stan Lee? Was he just a good scripter?
I think he was very good at mining other worlds for inspiring ideas. I think he talks about in his own biography, which should be taken with a pinch of salt, but he talks about how he was influenced at a young age by all the literary works that it just completely sparked ideas in his head, from, you know, reading, you know, things like, you know, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer to, you know, and then the Hardy Boys and all these kind of things to reading Poe and then reading even Shakespeare. He was very quick to point himself out that he was very, very well read child. As a writer, I think he's a very, very good writer, because I think what he's able to do is connect, and I think that, you know, he creates characters and issues and raises issues that people connect with it. I mean, that success that wouldn't have come unless he had this flair to do things. You know, he wanted to write the great American novel. He always said he wanted to write that, like all aspiring writers, American writers, and he felt frustrated he never did. But I think his contribution is rather significant to American culture, so he needn't sweat it that much. I think he's a very good writer. I think the fact that he was very good, as you pointed out quite rightly, for creating the voices in your head by the language used. So you say, you know, you knew when Ben Grimm was talking, you could tell it was the Thing, you know, with his dialogue, and you could tell when it was Spider-Man. And also the Silver Surfer later on,
Who's your favorite character? Yeah,
my favorite character, absolutely. I might have been just because I was a pretentious teenager and I really liked the philosophical posturing. I liked the fact the Silver Surfer would basically just hover around the earth going, what are you people doing?
Yeah.
You know, but I kind of liked the cod Shakespearean soliloquies and his philosophical musings on things. I wonder whether if I came to him now, I might find him a tad pretentious. But I enjoyed the flourish that Stan gave, you know, Norrin Rad. I liked it, and he was my favorite Marvel. A tie with Spider-Man, though, because I think Spider-Man is kind of the pinnacle.
He's like the comic Marvel character, isn't he?
He is.
Yeah.
He encapsulates everything that worked for Marvel, and I think it's very interesting to see it sort of on the big screen, because that's also what I wanted to do with the book. There are other biographies about Stanley, and I didn't want to write a biography. I wanted to basically do a celebration of American 20th century entertainment, because Stanley had been active through most of it, you know? So it was interesting to draw the parallels, the various attempts that Marvel had to try and, you know, get things on the radio, get things on TV, failing, and then getting things in the cinema, and then Stan's effort in the digital space and online, which was ahead of its time, really. He was quite right on the dawn of the new millennium. It was quite advanced for a man of his age to be leaving.
He had an amazing work ethic, presumably from growing up in the Depression. He never stopped. He was 96 when he died. And we're going to finish up with just a word or two about his movie career, because, of course, he appeared in a couple of dozen films.
Yes. I mean, not just his own films, but he popped up in strange cameos, like he's in Kevin Smith's Mallrats playing himself or whatever. And he'll, before he became Stan the Brand, which came with the post, I would say, 2008, when the Marvel Universe really started to kick off and start to work after a few stumbling blocks. And I think that was testament to exactly what he was very good at. He had become a brand by this point, in his final years, and people were excited to see the Stan Lee cameo.
He must have been absolutely thrilled to appear in those cameos in all those superhero films. And it would be one scene, maybe one line he'd get, and everybody would go, "Yeah, Stan, we've seen him."
Yeah, absolutely. And when he died, I think it's the beginning of Captain Marvel, there's always this Marvel sting where you'd see the different characters floating within the letters of the word Marvel. And it was all Stan's cameos because he just died. And there said a thanks, Stan, at the end of it. And if you couldn't help be touched by that if you were a Marvel fan.
Well,
because it was like...
We might all say thanks, Stan, mightn't we? If we liked the comics and if we liked the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Absolutely. I like Stan. And I can see why a lot of people don't. I can see why a lot of people who thought he gave, he sort of stepped on other creatives. But I like his gift of the gab. I think a lot of people could have benefited from a fraction of his showbiz sparkle and his charisma. I think that was his legacy. That he was able to just become the face of an entire cultural movement. That's impressive.
Stan Lee, How Marvel Changed the World by Adrian MacKinder is published by Pen and Sword White Owl imprint. £19.99 in Britain and $29.99 in America. Adrian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've had a wonderful time. Wonderful way to
Brilliant.
chat.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's always good to talk about our boyhood obsessions.
Exactly. Arrested Development.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.